I am coming to you live from the I am completely done van, also known as time for Brook to be an angry, angry skeleton today. I am so done. Let me ask you something, my loyal followers. Let me ask you a very important question. If any of you play video games, if any of you play tabletop games, if any of you play MMOs, if any of you play any sort of game that has multifaceted mechanics, that have player agency and decision making, a game in which the very gameplay experience that you have is dictated by your choices of some form of arbitrary choice, like the class you choose to play or the items you choose to use. Let me ask you something. In most instances, what do you do first when playing these kinds of games? You kind of just play how you want to play. But then once you've learned the game, what do? You tend to try to find the meta, the most effective tactic available. And this is true. You should, in a lot of cases, find out what the meta is. Now, the meta may be something as specific as if you take this specific class and take these specific items and do this specific build, it'll be a lot easier. Or it could be as generic as they do it in Pokemon, where it's just like, if you have this specific type on your team, most of the game is very, very easy. And if you have this other type on your team, the other half that the first type doesn't really cover, the second one covers extremely well, and thus most of your game experience is easy. But now let's go into the following question. When people design these kinds of games, what do you think they often do? What do you think they often do when designing these kinds of gameplay mechanics, or sort of gameplay loops, bonuses, gifts, or abilities, or anything that involves numbers interacting with other numbers in a way to make you advance the story, or advance in gameplay, or give you a different gameplay experience? What do you think they do? Because I'll give you a hint. Watching and reading several different videos and reading several articles about game design, they all say virtually the same thing. You start with a baseline, and whether or not that baseline exists currently, you have to find it. But most of the time you can find a baseline that fits generally what you're trying to do, and then you modify it accordingly to what you need it to do. And then, when you start designing it, you will, oftentimes, it is better to overestimate something than underestimate it. That is to say, it is better to make something that is slightly, if not drastically, overtuned in a beta stage or an alpha stage than it is to make something underpowered or underrepresented, because it is a lot harder to implement new things than to take away existing things. That is to say, if there is a mechanic in your game that does 10 different things, and doing all those 10 different things in this one option is drastically overpowered, then you just take away a few of the things. You lower some of the numbers. But if you have an ability or anything in any game that has one function, and that function is super situational, super hard to come by, or is just not worthwhile in comparison to other things that exist, it's a lot harder to add things, because in order to be competitive with other options to make everything just as viable as another option, everything has to have a similar level of functionality. Everything has to have a similar level of usefulness. Now, the problem with going with the weaker buffing up, as in you start with something terrible in the sense that it doesn't do anything or it does very little in the grand scheme of things, and you have to buff it up, versus starting with something really, really strong and then going down is that if your game is designed around features, let's just say your game is designed around options that you pick at certain intervals, and the options that you pick have to all be somewhat equal to one another in terms of their functionality. If there is one skill that is drastically stronger than everything else, and people tell you this, then you know you need to change it. You need to nerf it. And how do you do that typically? You lower the numbers, you remove some aspects of it, you move things around, you give the removed aspects to other skills, what have you. But you know what's harder to do? Take something that is as boring and basic and bland and not worth using at all, like 1% to something that is basically never going to happen, and broadening it or adding to it or making it better, because in those specific situations you have just made it better. But in the same vein, it's still so super situational that, yeah, it should deserve the extra power, but then if that situation is super common in your game design, then you've effectively made a skill that is a must-take. An example would be if you're trying to make a vampire game like V Rising or anything like that, and there's a skill in the game that says you deal 300% damage to all undead creatures. Well, all of V Rising is undead, so congratulations, you've just made a must-have to everything if there's no counter. So you either have to nerf it, remove it, change it, or what have you. And that's easier to do because you're like, okay, well, this is too strong, so let's just remove it and change it to something else. Or if it's not that bad, you just nerf it a little bit and you add something else. Or if there's a skill that does counteract it but it's weaker than this option, you just nerf one and buff the other. This way they're equal. Super simple. So, in my opinion, and in a lot of other game designers' opinions from what I've seen, going from a super strong build of anything that you're creating and then going to a more tuned down build is a lot better and a lot less stress than it is going from a weak version to a stronger, more balanced version. Because it's easier to go down a ladder than it is to go up one. It's the law of gravity. It's easier to go down to gravity or follow gravity than it is to go against it. So it's easier for you to go down into a more level, more balanced state than it is to climb up out of a pit to get to that equal state. And unfortunately, in a lot of games, that is how it works. As we've all seen with anybody who's played League of Legends, we get overpowered champions, and then they get nerfed to be balanced out. Unless you're Cassante, and then you don't get changed enough in order to actually be balanced at all. But those are few and far between. However, in Fabula, it seems as if the role is actually reversed. Because if you're creating content for the game, regardless of who you are, it's always better to start with garbage, literal dog water, than it is to start with something extremely good that can easily be nerfed. It is deemed as bad or taboo game design in Fabula, apparently, to make something strong right off the bat and then nerf it later than it is to make something stupid weak and then buff it later. So, to any of my viewers that are looking to make content for Fabula, keep that in mind. If you think something is too weak, leave it. Because most likely, the Fabula community will look at it and say, well, you know, that's not too bad, but if you just buffed it up a little bit, it'd be fine. Versus if you made something that you deem is perfectly acceptable in terms of balance, they'll say, nope, that's too broken, don't do that. Too OP, I'm not even going to bother looking at it anymore because you clearly don't know game design. So, just be wary of that.